Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast with Michael Becker and Paul Peebles. During this program, you will hear interviews with real-life successful investors who will share their stories and provide useful advice on how to acquire, finance, and operate apartment complexes. Now, here they are, Michael Becker and Paul Peebles.
Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Peebles, National Underwriter for Old Capital. And typically joining me today would be Michael Becker. But again, for the third week, he is on assignment doing some due diligence on a property that he is looking to acquire. So we'll be missing him today in the podcast. So, my father would always say to me, Paul, there's the right way and the wrong way of doing things. Unfortunately, some of the time I would do the wrong thing and I would have to learn from my mistakes kind of the hard way. In this podcast, as you know, we try to discuss the right way and the wrong way of investing in and operating apartments, so you don't have to learn the hard way. We all have some degree of common knowledge, meaning we all know something on that topic. That something may be the right or it may be the wrong. But without having years of experience in something, you have to listen to someone that has really done it. Someone that has made those mistakes. Today, we don't want to have common knowledge. We want to have specific knowledge. So today in the podcast, we have the teacher of doing it the right way. Doing it the right way in apartment ownership and management with best practices. She's an apartment veteran with over 30 years of experience in operations, human resources, and learning and development. She has taught residential property management programs for the University of North Texas School of Business. She's operated the Susan Weston Company since 2010 and has taught thousands of owners and apartment managers to be successful in owning and operating apartments. Let's say that she's wrote the driver's manual for apartment management. So I'd like to welcome Susan Weston.
Well, thank you, Paul. That's a very generous introduction. And I do. Actually, it's 40 years this year. Started as a receptionist in a property management office and was encouraged to do exactly what we're talking about here, get my professional designations, my professional credentials, posted rent on an old pegboard system. And I think 40 years in the industry, all that means is I'm still learning. Just today, I got a blog post on a fair housing issue, and I think probably many of us are dealing with those, regarding when federal law is not the same as state or local law, which supersedes. So I will be adjusting my fair housing training to report that attorney's findings.
So let's kind of just get into a little bit about what you do and have people kind of have a general idea, because if you don't have a mentor or an educational system, sometimes you don't have specific knowledge about how these apartments work. So you may think you want to get into the investment business to buy apartment buildings and you want to operate them. But if you don't have somebody that holds your hand and tries to make you do the right thing, not because you don't want to do the right thing, but you just don't know. So it comes down to what I don't know. I don't know. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about what you do, Susan.
Well, I consult and train. I am a subject matter expert with the National Apartment Association. And so I advise on curriculum development, and it's all very operational. It's all very hands-on. I think you are absolutely correct that you don't know what you don't know. And this, unfortunately, this is where we hear about landlords and owners who simply act out and do what they think might be a reasonable response or lay down a practical rule or protocol that they think is appropriate, and they end up stubbing their toe on either local regulations. They don't consider all factors involved. Resident expectations these days, the expectations of people that live in multifamily rental housing, I think are more exquisitely purposeful than they ever have been. And so very much the attention of tenant advocacy groups are stomping the ground and making sure that we as managers and operators are considering the needs of our renters. When you look at the statistics at how many people nationally now are in rental housing, it's at some of the highest levels since the end of the Korean War when everybody was buying homes. My role has always been the very practical, day-to-day, pushing the operations manual, which I've helped to write a number of those, which are best practices, of course, but actually manifesting them in day-to-day operations. I think you have to have somebody at the helm who understands that those are safety nets. I was just teaching a room full of portfolio supervisors this week in Austin and emphasized again that these records, this protocol, this system is a fabulous method with which to protect yourself from negligence or claims of liability or just omissions, just innocent omissions that get the attention of either tenant advocacy groups or the residents themselves. So my job is to be very hands-on. I don't teach a lot of book stuff. I do teach from a book, but the stories of the reality of affecting these policies is the message.
So you're where the rubber meets the road.
The rubber meets the road for sure.
So when people buy these properties, I mean, these are huge investments, whether it's for them personally or it's for maybe a small partnership, whether it is $1 million or it's 10 or 15, $20 million. A lot of people, again, have specific knowledge in their industry, what they maybe came out of being an engineer or a marketer or a doctor, but they don't have they don't have a book that kind of helps them kind of understand how to operate these properties properly, not to find themselves or their partners in problems, whether it's with the city or with the national advocates for fair housing. So I think what I wanted to do today is get kind of some bullet points that Susan talks about or teaches to her clients about trying to stay themselves out of jail, so to speak, or out of apartment jail, so they don't have any problems going down the road. So what keeps you up at night, Susan? What are some of the things that you've seen there's been issues with?
Quite frankly, the things that kind of are rearing their ugly heads are, obviously, you mentioned fair housing. Those issues are ever present. The whole confusion between what public area accommodations are versus housing where people live, their lives, slightly different actually at this point. Assistance animals is probably the number one concern for folks. What am I doing correctly? What do I get a doctor's note? Do I not get a doctor's note? Can I use my form? Lots of those questions going on. Those keep people up a lot. Most of that is about the ESAs, the emotional support animals. What constitutes an emotional support animal? How far do I need to go to accommodate? That's really been the biggest thing.
Can we turn off on that path just a little bit? Because
sure.
My sister, who has an apartment in San Diego, has a tenant that has an emotional support dog, and she's a small little sole proprietor property owner.
Right.
And she came to me, and I'm like, I don't really know how that works. So what's your advice on just a few comments? What do I tell my sister?
Okay, so the most important thing is to know is that assistance animals is the umbrella term. An assistance animal encompasses a service animal. A service animal is specifically trained to do a particular duty. For a quadriplegic, that would be somebody that would basically act as the arms and legs of the resident. For someone who is blind, for someone who had epilepsy and could sense epileptic seizures or diabetic comas coming on, that animal has been specifically trained for that. Therapy animals are animals that come through usually with a doctor's appointment, that are they're specifically used to help counsel a person, or psychological or psychoses, neuroses that people have in order to get them to open up. The emotional support animal is the biggest concern here, because an emotional support animal gets no training. An emotional support animal has absolutely no idea that they're an ESA. So an emotional support kitty does not understand that just their sheer presence in the crook of my arm makes it possible for me to go outside of my apartment door. That animal is very essential to how I live out my life. The important thing here is that the animal has got to be linked to the disability. HUD calls it a nexus. There has to be a connection or a crossover. And so a doctor's note frequently will not provide you with that. So the advice is to use a standardized form. I have one that I have worked on with fair housing attorneys that basically asks 3 questions. 1, it's a checkbox form. Is the person disabled based on the definition? And right on the form itself is the federal definition of a disabled person. Secondly, does the person require the following? And here is where the landlord would, your sister would write in exactly what this person is doing, what rule needs to be accommodated in order to enjoy the housing like everyone else. Yes or no? And then the last question, and this is something that a fair housing attorney suggested, but is really probably not enforceable. And that last question is, would you testify to the foregoing in a court of law? Yes or no? Just to put some teeth in it. But basically what you're doing is it's incumbent on the landlord to know specifically what we're asking to do here. Is it pit bull that's an ESA? Is it a pit bull that needs to go into the pool area with me? Is it a pit bull that needs to go into the pool with me? That was the interesting perspective on this blog post that I saw this morning, was basically the fact that if you had a municipal code that contradicted the federal code, for example, a municipal code that said animals cannot be in the swimming pools, you would likely have to prove direct threat. And not just direct threat based on breed, but direct threat based on that particular animal. They've had incidents of aggressive behavior, barking aggressively or charging or surging at strangers. And then you might have a chance to say, no, the animal can't go in the water. But if you cannot prove direct threat, and granted for landlords, that's a pretty high threshold, you're going to have to let that animal in the water. And then address, of course, everybody else's concerns about, well, why can't I bring an animal in the water, and what's going on with, that resident in 101. So basically the advice is to get a well-created, well-supported form to assist you. Now, technically, HUD says you cannot predicate your response on that resident completing your form. I'm telling you, the best answer there is to sell the form, just like you sell an apartment to a prospect. Hey, you're going to love it here. Look at how close it is to the Walmart. Easy access in and out here. You can get trains to the bus stops, block and a half away. There's all kinds of eateries. Whatever you do to sell that rental home that is very much, quite frankly, like everybody else's rental home. So you're selling that here to sell the form. Jody, we'd love to help you out with that accommodation. We have a fabulous form that we use. If you will give me the name and email address of your healthcare provider, I will just zip that form right out to them. 3 check boxes and we can have it back, and we'll be able to go to work on that for you right away. So I think that you have to kind of put a little icing on that to make it more palatable.
That's the difference between being book smart and street smart.
Yeah.
On that question. And then, can you charge pet rent for somebody that has to have an emotional support animal?
Sure. Good question. The answer to that is no, you can't charge a pet deposit or additional deposit for a pet, and you can't charge pet fees. You can, however, enforce every single other of your animal rules. Animals, for example, need to be under the control of the handler at all times. If I'm a quadriplegic and I have a support animal, obviously I can't hold a leash, but I have to be under voice control. So you can enforce no barking, vaccinations, no peeing on the patio, picking up after the dog. Those are all reasonable policies that you can enforce on any animal. But yes, you cannot, that's not a pet. That is not a pet. You have to view that animal as an extension, basically, of the resident. It allows them to enjoy the housing just like everyone else. So that's a distinctive point there. Pet fees are becoming a real bone of contention. There has just been passed in Seattle a rule that limits the amount of pet fees, pet rent, to be no more than 1/2 of 1 month's rent. Now, rents are astronomical in Seattle, and if you add on to that a first month's rent as a deposit plus a pet deposit. Pet deposits now they've put a cap on it. And another thing they just passed, and I think this is indicative of what investors need to be aware of, is that our municipal agencies, our state agencies are very, very involved in, as I say, getting in your chili, living in your seat every day. They're passing ordinances and rules and fees that are impactful in your daily operation. So in this particular case, in Seattle, they just passed a rule not only about the pet fees or the pet deposits, but now move-in fees for new residents in Seattle can be paid out over 6 months. And I think that parallels the astronomical increase in rents. And so we're trying to make that more palatable for residents. So I get that. But here locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I just saw a notice where one of the mid-city suburbs have taken their annual inspection fees from like $12 a unit up to like $32 a unit, and then requiring 2 inspections in the span of the year. So they're looking for ways to make their money back. Obviously, they're going to get some tremendous tax income these days because of the appreciation in value. But I think investors need to be very, very aware that yeah, there are some great proceeds to be made in terms of value appreciation just from the sheer market conditions that you're in and the demand for rental housing. But if you're not on your toes operationally, you can erode value. You can call to question that NOI stream that, of course, is the basis for your valuation of income producing property.
A lot of information out of Susan. That's why I enjoyed listening to Susan, is that she has some of the dynamics of what you need to know. Airlines have been dealing with the emotional support animals for a long period of time. I really haven't seen anything that changed. That's just getting larger. So hopefully that will.
That's an interesting point, Paul, that you raise on the airlines, because the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, is the legal act that covers service animals in public areas, the Bank of America, Chili's, on a plane, etc. And the ADA in 2011 modified their rules that basically said the only animal allowed in a public area is a service animal. So an ESA does not count. And that service animal has to be a dog or a miniature horse. So technically, and I confirmed this with a fair housing attorney, technically right now, the ADA rules regarding the public areas of your property are different than the fair housing rules. Your office at your multifamily property, your rental property, is a public area, open to the public. Technically, the only animal that can come in there is a service dog. However, it is also a rental center for your residents. So Mary, who lives in 601, has got an ESA kitty cat. Can she bring that in your office when it is also an office of public accommodation? So there are some interesting questions here at hand.
Let's transfer from animals to tenants, humans. Very litigious these days.
Yes.
What are some of the things that we got to keep an eye out for?
We're hearing a lot, again, that HUD encourages any resident who feels like they've had their preferences or their lifestyle jeopardized in any reason for any of the 7 protected classes. They make it very, very easy to file a charge of fair housing. In addition to disability. Disability, incidentally, in the HUD report ending September 2016, disability was 59% of all claims. So it's not necessarily just the animals relative to disability. Number 2 is kind of a tie, and that is race and familial occupancy. Familial occupancy is starting to grow simply because of occupancy standards. There is no federal law about occupancy standards. Some states have rules, some don't. If you are working with housing agency clients, they may have their own rules. If I've got a subsidy, a voucher resident, there may be rules in that housing agency that say after the minor occupants reach age of 8, I'm making that up as an example, but you can no longer have a male and female minor occupant in the same bedroom, yet they only have a voucher for a 2-bedroom apartment. So those are cases that are concerning, not applying to everyone, but if you look globally, the whole prospect of negligence, safety, harm, was the light out or wasn't it out, trip hazards, resident liability, trip and fall hazards are big things as well. But I think residents by far and away are so eager these days to claim fair housing violation because I'm Muslim or because I'm any member of the protected class, because I have HIV, just your normal operating procedures. You can't tell a family who speaks only Korean and doesn't speak any, if any English, for their adult occupant child, that they probably won't want to feel comfortable coming to the resident event because they won't be able to talk to anybody. You can't do that. You can't indicate to somebody that they're not welcome, basically, because they can't speak the language. I think for us, risk management is something I encourage managers. That hat needs to be worn at all times. Residents are just looking at pointing the finger at landlords, and that is not a fun situation to be in. They're going to allege habitability issues where, you're not fixing my electricity quickly enough, or I've got an infestation problem, when in fact you've got a hoarder in that building and they're causing a lot of the issues as well. So it's a crazy time to be a landlord, to be operating property. I think you have to have true north. You have to have a valid resource. One of the ones that I use in my courses at the residential property management courses, a new text that we actually got okay through the University of North Texas, is the multifamily housing text. It is available on the National Apartment Association store. I think it's about $59.95 or $69.95. And it is a fabulous resource for a very specific, very hands-on. There's some great case studies in the back of the book, lots of references, a basic tool to understand and learn property management.
So before you make them a tenant, they have to go through a screening process.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit, just your feeling about the screening process. It has to be a screening process that maybe is written down. So you just...
Thank you for saying that. Yes, as a matter of fact, your criteria, that's actually a HUD ruling. Your criteria needs to be posted and made available to your prospects. A standardized applicant screening process is critical. It needs to be posted somewhere. I see a lot of management companies that have printed it out on a piece of paper and then put it in a nice little Dollar Tree frame and stuck it on the leasing desk or posted it on the wall. And I also see it going into any kind of collateral materials that you're sending to the applicant after the fact, or sticking it in a folder when they're looking at a residence. So we're talking about credit. We're talking about criminal. We're talking about resident history. In other words, you're going to go back and check with previous landlords. We're going to talk about pets. We're going to talk about how many vehicles you can bring on property. We're going to talk about occupancy limits, how many folks intend to live in the unit. You need to clarify all of that beforehand, because if it comes up later and you say, oh, I forgot to tell you, we won't allow you to park your semi on the property, it's going to look reactive. It's going to look potentially prejudicial, and you don't want to give any kind of perception in that regard. You also have to abide by federal laws regarding searching someone's credit and acting upon someone's credit. Clearly stated criteria, whether it's going to be a manifestation of open accounts that are up to date, what percentage of open accounts need to be up to date, what kind of income criteria. You certainly can set reasonable income criteria. Most often I see used is 2.5 to 3 times the amount of the rent has to be brought in monthly, and then your ability to check and prove that, usually through W-2 statements. Some folks, they take the 3 most recent paycheck stubs, but you need to be consistent about executing those policies. HUD just issued a ruling last September that said that landlords can no longer use arrest records to disqualify potential residents. And the fact of the matter is, their reasoning is that arrest records have a disparate impact. And in truth, that's absolutely true. The statistics are that for every, I read this from the Department of Justice, for every one Caucasian incarcerated, felony criminal incarcerated between the ages of 18 and 34, there's something like 6 African Americans and 4 Hispanics. So I grew up in the industry using a policy that we don't want to talk to you if you've been arrested. Whether you were found guilty or not, the fact that you were around where something illegal was going down and you were hauled in, we just don't want to talk to you. Markets were good. If you didn't like it, there'd be somebody else in the door pretty quickly and we could rent to them. HUD's saying no, that you can no longer do that. They're also saying that you have to use not automatic exclusions, but discretionary exclusions when it comes to crimes and misdemeanors and felonies. If somebody had a DWI 8 years ago and it was felonious, so it was bad, but since that time, it was 8 years ago, and since that time, they have had a clear record. The government says, how does this represent a challenge to you, Mr. Landlord? Why not let this person have a place to live? There are, again, DC, the District of Columbia, they're considering a bill that will limit the look-back period to 5 years so that a landlord can't look back any further than that. You also have to give that resident a copy of their FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, summary of rights. If you disqualify them based on something that's in their credit report, they have a right to get a letter. It's called an adverse action letter that tells them, hey, you've been disqualified based on this criteria. Here's the 800 number where you can fix that. So just, great point. Just screening and qualifying applicants is a tortuous journey. You can make it a whole lot easier by being consistent and have a recorded criteria screening policy that you use for everybody.
All right, Susan, you've scared the hell out of me. I'm
sorry.
I'm not going to buy any
Sorry, I
apartments.
got to go off on those tangents a little bit. It's so important.
I'm a big believer in education and being, crystal clear in knowledge and trying to transfer, say Susan's knowledge over to you, the investor or the property management company, because, if you are buying apartment buildings, you have a responsibility to your partners, your investors into the transaction. And so you're not the property management company. You've hired, say, the property management company, but don't put all your faith into the property management company. Know enough, know what the rules are, follow up on the rules, have somebody say like Susan help you out, making sure that you understand it. And you do have a responsibility to the people who have invested with you. Make sure you understand a little bit more about some of the rules out there. Let's talk a little bit about some fun stuff about marketing the properties, what's going on, social media type of stuff, and what are some of the things about the reputation of a property, trying to track down using social media.
Right. Great question, because that certainly is in everybody's mind. It doesn't matter whether you're trying to attract a millennial or somebody who's young. I use checks and do searches and use ratings, star ratings. I just read something from a conference that was held last year that millennials will not consider anything with a 1 or 2 star rating. So if you're talking about Yelp or apartmentratings.com or even Facebook posts, people who post on their Facebook, obviously it goes out to all of their contacts, all of their friends, what they have to say about a place. It's interesting, just yesterday in class, we were talking about the due diligence process and how property supervisors are often involved in that. But speaking to you as owners of residential real estate, a great takeaway from this individual's comment, he said that what they did is as part of their due diligence process, and you should probably have a list, check this, check that, check that. He said, we have now added checking Yelp and apartment rating sites to our due diligence. He said, here's what we found out. So many of the Yelp comments had in them complaints about windows leaking and huge utility bills, and that was one of the primary complaints of people who had rated the property poorly. So they went back in their physical inspection and looked at the windows, and sure enough, the windows needed to be reset, recaulked. They were leaky, old windows and doors, and they built that into their purchase price demand. So they asked for a haircut on the purchase price because of they were facing this additional expense based on what the consumer had told them. Consumer-driven marketing is the message of the day.
Again, back to that, that's definitely a big point. We underwrite these transactions to reputation risk in the marketplace itself, because some of these properties, I'll give you an example. There's a property that I'm familiar with that the offering memorandum looks great, property looks wonderful, and then when we're underwriting the transaction, we go on a Google search and we find out that property had a news story on how the tenants have seen their sewers back up, roaches, complaints to the city, all kinds of different things. That's not going to be in the offering memorandum, but that's definitely in the Google search on the specific property. So you're going to do some of your own physical due diligence, but I'm going to do a lot of due diligence myself to
Absolutely.
kind of figure out what our reputation risk is on the property.
Do the Yelp search, do the Google search. Those are incredibly interesting, and obviously there's people that just go on tirades and they just go on rants, and obviously if the post is old, that's probably not going to bear as much fruit as others. But also a tip for folks who are managing properties is to manage the reputation. If somebody does post about your property, it might be a rant, know or have your manager know enough on how to respond to that. Managers need to do that search weekly. They need to Google up their own property, take a look, see what is being, how their people are talking about their property. And if somebody's ranted, respond by saying, so sorry to hear that you had that experience. You did not leave a contact information, but please reach out to me. I am available, would love to bring about a more satisfactory conclusion. So monitoring your reputation is a whole lot different than managing your reputation.
Let's get down into the weeds about, we want these properties to be profitable, little cash registers. And how do we increase value? What are you seeing these days in, owning properties? What's getting some additional marginal income, whether it is, parking space or washers and dryers or things that are increasing revenue on properties?
Right. We're seeing a lot more of that. As we all know, in operations, the impact of adding income is far greater than any impact of controlling expenses, because there is a point of diminishing return on expenses. Yes, you need to control expenses, but the ceiling is much higher on income. Now, obviously, of course, rents are 90% of your income for sure. There's maybe, I think the industry standard is that you're going to get back 5 or 6% in other income, meaning 5%, 6% of gross. But there are very creative ways to get that ancillary income. Another topic of conversation that came up this week was packages. A lot of offices are taking packages. It is very expensive to install a locker system. There are now third-party companies that will provide you with software so that when a package is delivered, they will immediately, one that comes to mind is called Active Building, but there are others that will immediately text a resident, say, hey, you had a package delivered today, come get it. I am seeing management companies actively put penalty fees. If you don't pick up that package in 48 hours, it's $5 a day for me to hold your package, because frankly, between you and me, we don't have room to hold those packages, and that's not going to end. I'm also seeing penalty fees increase astronomically. So if I discover through someone's taking a picture, your animal left that little deposit on the grass, that's going to cost you $350 instead of $150 as a penalty. So we are really ramping those things up. You mentioned washers and dryers. Washers and dryers in apartments is probably one of the most sought after in-unit amenities. Not just the connections, but the actual equipment. There are a lot of providers that will, so that you don't have to go into the washer and dryer business. Frankly, I don't want to maintain a washer and dryer. So if I have a rental agreement, a big rental agreement, so a bulk rental agreement from a provider, and I can rent that equipment for $20 a month, $25 a month, I'm going to turn around and allow the resident to rent it for $35 a month. and I don't have any responsibility to move it. You call the company, they come move it in, move it out, and it's another way. And I know that seems like small dollars, but folks, when you start applying 7 and 8% cap rates, even lower than that, based on whether it's a B, or C deal, urban core or suburban, secondary market or tertiary market, obviously cap rates fluctuate. But if you capitalize the value of a buck, it's significant. And this is money basically that your investors, if they're smart, are going, wow, that's money being left on the table. I need a piece of that.
Talk to me a little bit about, maintaining your property. I think maintenance keeps tenants in the properties. What's your take on maintenance?
Maintenance has actually kind of come into its own. In my class this week in Austin, the majority of them were singing the blues because they had open maintenance spots. Very, very hard to find qualified maintenance technicians. Frankly, anybody in AC or plumbing, they're probably going to be licensed and they're making pretty significant hourly wages. In that respect, in our industry, the acceptable range of what a maintenance technician gets has gone up, and your maintenance techs are asking for more money. But I got to tell you, I also have many, many managers who go from property to property. If they get hired at a different property, they will turn around and bring that maintenance tech with them, because that relationship between the manager and maintenance is so important. Maintenance is in your residents' homes more than your office personnel. So they express the tone, the professionalism, the courtesy of your management just by being in their units. Definitely operating rules in place for conduct inside resident units. Frankly, more and more residents are equipping their interiors with cameras and recording equipment. So I think you have to be sure that your maintenance technicians, when they go in to provide service in an occupied unit, maybe the resident isn't at home at the time, they need to be very aware that they could potentially be watched. We always teach them that if you have to go fix there's an under the sink leak in the hall bathroom, then you don't need to be in the bedroom. There's no reason for you to be in the bedroom. Do your job. Very essential that you have a work order system that records when somebody is in there, how many hours or approximately what their hours was. They spent 30 minutes. Some management companies, not many, but some management companies, managers like to keep track of what that part costs. If they have to do a part, even a 20-cent seal is going to take you 30 minutes from the time your maintenance technician picks up that work order, goes into the apartment, makes the repair, and either circles back to get another work order. I think that there are some efficiencies that are important in maintenance, but maintenance is absolutely critical. It is linked directly to your ability to retain residents. If you don't want to keep that churn of turnover, nationally turnover is about 54%. If you don't want that churn, you've got a 50-unit property. That means you're going to turn 25 units in a year. If you've got maintenance that can save you 10 of those, then at a turn cost, including rent loss of, I see numbers at $1,500 to $2,500, that's controllable expense that can make a difference to the bottom line. Maintenance being understanding their role in resident retention, their role in internal marketing is critical.
And having inventory control.
Inventory.
On these properties too, just making sure that everybody's maintaining these properties, not only for the tenants, but also for the landlords, and making sure that things just don't walk off the property. So we understand that. Tell us a little bit about the industry itself. I mean, there's the National Apartment Association, and we live in the state of Texas, so you have the Texas Apartment Association, and then you have, depending on where you live in Texas, where it's Houston or it's Dallas or any places in between, how critical is it to join your apartment association in trying to get some information from them about what's going on and changes? Great
question. Actually, I, in my career, got my start and my exposure, my experience through affiliations with the apartment associations. Yeah, Texas is one of the most active associations. The National Apartment Association is headquartered in Virginia. There are 170 affiliated local associations, state and local associations. They represent a huge resource to you as an owner, operator, or advice on management, local management. They also will sponsor educational programs for credential programs, the certified apartment manager, the national apartment leasing professional, the certificate in apartment maintenance technician. So these are great programs. Many of those programs are also available online. But what's great about your aligning with the apartment association is your access to their treasure trove of talent. Virtually every apartment association has an active government affairs group that stays on top of this. Incident that I was talking about in the mid-cities here of the Dallas-Fort Worth area is being monitored closely by the government affairs executive, Perry Pillow, over the Apartment Association of Tarrant County. They're local, they're grassroots, they've got volunteer folks that are plugged into what's going on locally so they can bring empirical evidence back to a city council or something and actively change the direction of some of these adverse rulings that we're running into. So every local affiliate has got a government affairs group. Also, some of the larger affiliates, quite frankly, have got a very active independent rental owner group. I know in Dallas, particularly, the Independent Rental Owner Committee meets every other month. There is always a speaker of content, a lunch meal together. And there is actually a credential, the IROP credential, the Independent Rental Owner Professional. It is an online program that is a great resource from an overview perspective of property management, and certainly a credential that you could put on a business card. So when you stand in front of a city council and plead against an onerous regulation that is being contested, I'm an independent rental owner professional. I have a credential in that. I know this business, and this is going to be counterproductive to my business as a landlord.
So in our final few moments here, and I could talk to you forever because you and I are on the same page about.
Great. I love being on the same page.
Trying to do it right. Let's say the economy softens up and values stay the same or possibly go down. It is really optimization of property management is going to make or break these properties. And you as an owner and the one that's responsible to the partnership have got to understand what the rules are to do it right, to stay in bounds for that. Let's turn out and talk a little bit more about what people can do that maybe don't have a mentor, don't have an educational program, want to maybe join the apartment association in their hometown, about classes or certifications that people to take. You talked about it real briefly, maybe that CAMS class. Can you go in a little bit more detail what that CAMS class is? Should you take it before you buy the property? Should you take it after you buy the property? Tell me a little bit more about CAMS or even CAPS too.
Well, either, I hate to say whether we should do it before or after. Clearly, before is always better because it's preemptive, but being able to take the class is important. It is a pretty intensive class in that there are 8 modules. I am planning to teach it over September and October here in the Dallas area. But again, many of those affiliates that I mentioned before have those classes. So if you're in North Carolina, I know North Carolina's got some very active programs. The state of Washington, many of the local ones will put it on in a classroom setting. It is also available online that can be taken at any time. There is a pretty significant test. I won't tiptoe around that. It's a 4-hour proctored exam. So it's you have to be ready for this. We're talking about marketing techniques in that. We're talking about property maintenance, including preventive maintenance and hiring maintenance technicians and how to manage a service request program. And these are all very practical tools. We talk in human resources, managing that manager, managing the staff. That's another area that we didn't go into in this particular podcast, but something I think that we may want to explore later is the value and the risk of people on staff, just simply managing that human resource. Risk and liability is always a big section. Legal, or not only just fair housing, but landlord-tenant law. And obviously the CAM presents it from a national perspective, but it certainly raises the awareness. And you mentioned it earlier, Paul. One of the most significant takeaways here is just to know enough to know that you've got to ask somebody. Don't jump in and until you reach a confidence level or you've had that situation happen before, get a hold of somebody who's knowledgeable that can give you sometimes you're too close to the issue and you need somebody who can, from an overview perspective, from experience, give you some information. And I think the most important piece in the CAM is the financial management piece, understanding the role of income and how managers can actually make a difference, how income equates to value using the income valuation approach. An eye-opener to sit down with a manager and go through a financial statement. I think the more you let your on-site staff understand the financial picture of the asset, the better results you'll get.
How do people work with you? I mean, if you're just a treasure trove of information, what's the best way for somebody to get a hold of you? And let's talk a little bit about that.
I'm happy to answer one-off questions on particular needs or just to give you some resources that I have. I'm a huge fan of data and research because of what it tells me. I am available always via email. I travel quite a bit, but I'm available via email. My email is quite simply Susan@SusanWeston.com. That's WESTON, not IN like the hotel. Susan@SusanWeston.com. I'm happy to visit with you about that. I can turn you on to some resources so that you can obviously make some of these calls in the future on your own. But if you've got a situation, I would love to be able to at least weigh in with my experience and my tools so that you, again, make that right decision. It's always easy to be preemptive rather than to go into recovery mode.
We got millions of dollars that you're responsible for. If you're the managing member, key principal in the transaction, make sure that you do the right thing. And whether it's Susan or somebody like Susan, you want to get a relationship with somebody that knows what the hell they're doing and transfer your common knowledge into specific knowledge with the help of Susan and her team. So Susan, thanks for being on the podcast. We very much appreciate it. We'll try to have you back here maybe this time next year and kind of see what some of the new rules been implemented and some of the changes that we need to be cognizant of and make sure that we're doing the right thing, right?
Right. This has been a great experience, and I can guarantee you things will change. So thanks again, Paul, for asking me.
No problem. If you want more information about how transactions are structured financially, make sure you send an email or go into the oldcapitalpodcast.com website. Old Capital Podcast, again, we have a 15-page white paper report. Make sure you ask about that, and we'll help you kind of understand how these transactions are put together. So I'm Paul Peebles. Susan Weston, thanks a lot for your time. We appreciate it. We'll talk to everybody soon.
Thanks for listening to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. Please join us at oldcapitalpodcast.com to sign up for our weekly email updates. We'll see you next week for another great interview.